the changes that we're witnessing now are profound, but they're going to be more profound in 10 years and more profound than that in 20 years. And so, yeah.
I have a question about the equator and what I read about that the equator is a safer, to be closer to the equator. Could any of you, Nicholas, maybe address what I read a little clearer?
Well, I don't know if it's safer at the equator. I mean, it's definitely going to be the climate change is tends to be bigger in terms of like temperature magnitude changes, anomaly changes at the poles than it is at the equator.
Okay.
So in that respect, it's not as dramatic, but for the ecosystems that exist near the equator, for the people that live near the equator, small changes mean a lot. It's sort of like being in the ocean too. The climate or the temperature of the ocean is changing slower than that of the land, but the changes that do occur have a huge impact on the species that live in the ocean. It's the same thing at the equator. You have these smaller magnitude changes in temperatures and stuff like that, but it goes from being hot to being really hot. You kill a bunch of life, you kill a bunch of people because it gets too hot and people are migrating to get out of
To add a
there.
little bit to what Nick was saying about what places are most sensitive, I think is the best way to understand it. Actually, I think the region of the worlds that are least sensitive to climate are going to be the mid-latitudes because they experience such a wide array of seasonality, whereas the Arctic and the equators experience the least seasonality in on our planet. So as Nick was saying, because these places, these regions experience less change in their as they annually traverse the world, they are more sensitive to changes due to climate change. Whereas in the mid latitudes, where we, full blown seasons, summer, winter, the biology is more adapted to change. However, as climate change brings us more outside of that natural variability, that's when we start to see ecosystems break down. And we get outside of that natural variability sooner in places like the equator, in places
Okay. Yeah,
like
that,
the Arctic. One
that
degree
makes sense
Celsius
to me.
warmer in the equator could actually be quite devastating. I remember just very quickly, Jennifer, excuse me, Sandy, that we were talking about chronic disturbances in the rainforest and the impact that just 1.5 degrees has had on the number of insects, insect biomass in the rainforest. So just a little bit leads to a lot.
Just a little bit. Like arsenic. Arsenic.
Mm-hmm.
The planet. Some old lady up there is playing a magnificent joke, poisoning the planet. Lord. Well, we do have the next article that you guys wanted to go over because it was another important one. Sink or swim. A historic year of floods in Asia. And the first graphic just shows you these are their homes. And they're just being flooded out of their homes. Take it away.
Yeah. So, I mean, as the article states, I mean, 2020 has been a crazy year for flooding in the Asia Pacific region. I mean, it goes over the fact that 2.7 million people were evacuated in China and 63 million were affected in total by the flooding in China. Nepal had 4,500 landslides from torrential rains, and at one point, 1/3 of Bangladesh was underwater. So, and you also had flooding impacts in parts of Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So it's been an absolutely crazy wet season for parts of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Now, typically, you get obviously a dry season and it gets hot, and this drives a monsoon response where you get rainfall that comes in from the Pacific and Indian Oceans into India, into Southeast Asia, China, and those in those areas, Indonesia. And this year has been a La Nina year, so which means you have abnormally cooler temperatures in the Eastern Pacific, in the Eastern Pacific Basin, near South America, Central America, and such. But this is caused by a stronger easterly trade winds that go from east to west. You get the upwelling that produces the colder temperature water in the east, but all that warm water pools out west, and all that warm water drives thunderstorm activity and strong monsoon activity that then pushes onto the land and produces all the heavy rain. So you've had a lot of heavy rain in that region. Now, the thing with climate change is that not only does it causes a couple things. One, it causes heavier rainfall events in general. So you get heavier 2-inch, 3-inch, 4-inch, 5-inch rainfall events per hour, rainfall events, like very, very heavy rainfall. But it also, for this region, there's been a trend towards a shortening of the wet season and a lengthening of the dry season. So you're getting shorter periods where you get heavy rainfall, but you're getting more heavy rainfall events in that shorter time period, which is generating all this flooding and all this torrential rains that you see. But then you get the dry season that's longer and more profound, more intense, so you can lead to drought. So you're getting these cycles where you can go from drought to floods to drought more frequently in parts of Southeast Asia and China and India. And that's expected to get worse as climate change continues to evolve, where you just have this very increasingly shorter period of very heavy rainfall events, and then a lengthening of a dry season where you get a lot of drought. And obviously the effects of El Nino, La Nina, these normal weather climate patterns in the Earth system will either diminish or enhance those climate change related impacts. So we're really just seeing the beginnings of what will be intense extremes in parts of Asia, where a lot of people on the planet will be exposed to the events.
And in our country, really, with all the distractions all over our media, how much does the layperson, the regular Joe, the people walking around, do they really know about what's going on over there?
People,
or do they care?
And this is a serious point.
Sure it is.
So the World Bank has recognized Oceania, Malaysia, Southeast Asia is one of the prime places to be impacted by both climate change and sea level rise. An estimated population of 300 million people, that's almost the whole of the continental United States, will be impacted by just flooding due to hydraulic, and that's under the IPCC's projection. So we're talking about massive destabilization in these populations, saltwater intrusion destroying a lot of the crop production and the Mekong Valley. So we're talking about destabilizing populations in these governments of tens of millions of people in a very short period of time. What we've seen in China, for example, and the World Bank has also now called for countries to halt building dams, what they call gray infrastructure, and water diversion, and start focusing on ways to kind of reaffirm and beef up natural coastal systems and to create more open floodplains and to allow marshlands to, kind of come back on the coast. And these things would certainly help. But what we're also looking at climate changes. Two things are impacting the Asian populations: hyper urbanization and other places that they're building just to settle these populations are on very dangerous lands, places that ought to be floodplains, places that really development shouldn't occur. So we're seeing that at the same time that we're seeing absolutely historic rainfall events. And we're seeing historic, people are talking about the named storms here in the West. The number of storms that have hit just Japan, China, Indochina, formerly known, and Malaysia over the last 5 years, it's been absolutely historic. And they're facing superstorms. Of course, the waters in the far eastern Pacific are much warmer than what we see routinely, and they've just been driving these magnificent storms. And one of the discussions that are coming up geopolitically is, are we going to have to relocate these populations to countries that are top emitters? So that goes to your question, Hawkins, paying attention, because people that are in extremely vulnerable places are now asking the question, should the United States be forced to let in a lot of these areas?
U.S. Government reported military, I think the Army did it or something, it talked about the U.S. military may, collapse in 20 years, the next 20 years because of climate change impacts. And Bangladesh obviously was highlighted because it's the prime example of a nation that may become a failed state because you don't have any land. It's all going underwater, and people are trying to migrate to India, try to migrate to other countries. And I mean, that's like really just one example of what you're going to be seeing globally from the global south and many other places as climate change advances. Because, of course, the question Antonio brought up is there really a place to escape climate change? You're going to have people that are going to be escaping one specific thing, like, oh, I'm leaving because I can't grow crops anymore because the land is underwater too much, so I move to another area. But then you face these, mega storms, or you face incredible heat somewhere else. It's going to be very challenging because nations that already have issues with, xenophobia or something, are they going to really let in, when they have their own problems, let in people that are desperate for anything to live off of because their nations are failing because of climate change? So, I mean, that's really what we're going to be seeing in the next 20, 30 years, is starting to see some nations, particularly poorer ones, crumble, and then the big emitters being, maybe, forced or not forced because they will resist bringing in people from these poorer countries. And a lot of issues with, I mean, you might see from a political aspect, see a lot more right-wing governments rise up to resist, any acknowledgement of climate change, but also resist having immigrants come to their countries. You're already seeing the beginnings of that again. You get dramatically worse.
Oh, absolutely, it's happening. It'll be countries, I mean, just thinking of the cranes in building, it's going to be building up more cities because immigration always draws the populations to the cities, at least to start. Mm-hmm. That's how it was historically in the United States. People went to the cities, then they sprinkled out towards the farmland. But geopolitically, I mean, we already have the climate people. We already have. Look how we're treating people in this country at the border that are coming from Guatemala and El Salvador. We treat them horribly.
Tear gas. Remember a few years ago they got tear gas at the border? Yeah.
I mean, the things that are going on are already horrible.
Nick, I wonder if you're citing, there are two different institutions or groups that I'm thinking of that you could be citing. The one in the United States is the Center for International Strategic Studies, and the other one's led by David Spratt and I forget Ian Dunlap, his co-author.
Oh yeah, they were in Australia, I think. Yeah, those guys are in Australia.
Yeah, and they were basically, both of these groups, looking at, like you say, the geopolitics of climate change, because that's essentially the human feedback. And the fear is that as the climate crisis worsens, that, as Nick says, countries will become increasingly recalcitrant. They become increasingly nationalistic. And then the conversation on emissions completely goes out of the window. Because, of course, who's going to be focusing on emissions when you're focusing on feeding your population? When you're India, for example, they don't have the same type of politics we do, right? So in India, not only did they build the wall, they put machine guns on them. So it's a different level of politics.
And they have Modi now,
it's a different level of politics that's occurring all over the world. And look at what's happening with Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. That's another, if you want to think about it, climate breakdown, because we need the Amazon rainforest to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. And what is Brazil doing? It's going to completely slash and burn the Amazon for its own resources. As the climate change crisis worsens, they'll have to dig deeper into the forest. And so, it's another feedback. So we're starting to see now the human system feeding back quite viciously on the climate as well. We're talking about the openings in the Arctic. Well, that's the next stage for World War III. The Chinese, who don't even have any land connected to the Arctic, are claiming a stake.
Yeah.
Of course, the Russians have the biggest stake. The Americans are militarizing the Arctic as well. The Canadians are militarizing the Arctic. So we're starting to see our politics is not trying to necessarily control the crisis, but exploit it.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. That's it is. It's exploit. Well, that's what we are. We're exploiters, and what other species just kills for pleasure? None. Here we are. But I'm not going to say beat up you. So we have one more that we didn't cover that Nicholas was going to cover, and this article is dealing with Australia, and this is the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub National Environmental Science Programs, and it was record 2020 spring temperature across Australia virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. So, Nick, you want to take it away?
Sure. So, if you haven't heard, it was the warmest November on record in Australia and the warmest spring on record. And they basically used climate models to run some experiments to see statistically how likely it would be to have such a hot spring without climate change, and they found that it was, as they said, virtually impossible to have such a hot spring without climate change. I think it was without climate change, it would be a 1 in 500,000 year event. So, I mean, it's pretty solid that climate change is causing temperatures in the spring and summer and throughout the year in Australia to just get hotter. And I mean, Australia has been really one of those places that are, where it's populated, that is really seeing some amazing climatic impacts from climate change. And I think the biggest eyeball for me is just the wildfires. I mean, they're absolutely insane in Australia. Obviously, in the past couple of years, there have been billions of animals that have been lost to the wildfires. Millions of acres of forests and grasslands destroyed, lives lost, human lives lost. So it's been, and there's also been cyclones as well that hit Australia. So they've besides the United States, they are really a nation that just has been facing an absolute onslaught because of human-induced climate change and the worsening impacts of that.
Unbelievable. So there's some pretty cool graphs in this article. If I pull them up, perhaps we can just take a quick look at what they said, what they show. So this one, and I'm going to. Did I resume this? No. Yeah. All right, let's pull this one up. Can you see this one? This was, and I thought maybe you might want to look at this one. The spring mean temperature anomaly in Australia.
Yeah, that one's I think the easiest for people to understand. It's basically been going up consistently since the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, where you've been getting increasingly warm temperatures and record warm years or record warm springs in Australia. And I remember talking to in an interview a few years ago or a couple of years ago with Guy McPherson, and talked to him about him a lot. I haven't talked to him in a while, but I told him that, he talks about obviously abrupt climate change and when it starts and everything else. I told him that it was my opinion that abrupt climate change started in the 1980s, because in the 1980s or late 70s is really when globally you really started to see an acceleration in the warming of the world, the warming of the land masses, the warming of the oceans, and the melting of sea ice. You just look at every graph and you see this consistent slant that really starts to hit you in the 1980s in the rise of temperatures, decline of ice, and it just it's interesting because I was born in the mid 1980s. And 1984, and I grew up, in Seattle, and I grew up in a place that was, known to be so wet and in the fall and winter and cool, and then by the 2010s, it's like Washington State's on fire, and smoke is masking temperatures near 100 degrees and in Seattle, and it's just like what happened to where I lived. And that's the same phenomenon a lot of Australians, I suspect, are feeling, where you have summertime temperatures in spring now, and you wonder what the heck is summer going to look like. And we're going to be sitting around probably next month and the month after discussing exactly what's going on in Australia, because they're getting a very dramatic changes into the landscape, and it affects people, it affects animals, ecosystems, water. So we're really seeing it right now in Australia.
Well, even where I live, it's been in the 50s, and it's December, and I said, I doubt we're going to get the kind of snow that. I mean, Jennifer, you had -7. You had 7. We had 50 something. And if I pull up the temperature now, it's probably the phone's off. It's probably in the 40s. I'm not using a lot of firewood.
We had snow a couple days ago here in Lincoln, or the other day here in Lincoln, Nebraska, but earlier this week, it was in the 60s. We had record high temperatures, 63, 64 degrees in December here in Lincoln. It was very pleasant weather.
And we're today.
Yeah.
And we were today in North Carolina sitting at 71. And, the average high for this time of year is 54 degrees. So we're almost doing 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. And we're seeing more days like this proliferate into the winter. And it is startling because I'm seeing that obviously the birds and the spiders are confused. I've lived here my whole life, and
It's true.
well, it sounds funny, but I still
It's
see spiders out.
not.
They should not be out. I hear springtime birds. That I should not be hearing them. And you can see that, just as Nick was recounting, the entire biosphere is responding to this, and they are responding in a state of shock. And what's happening in Australia, just to recount those numbers, because we were all confused. It was this time last year in Australia, right as we're going into the new year, that we lost 1.5 to 2 billion different animals in what I call a holocaust, because of course the word holocaust means a burnt offering. And so you see that, and it's just, it's truly, it's truly horrific, because the UN Environment Program warned us in 1990 that just 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial would elicit extensive ecosystem damage. And Australia is seeing 2 degrees Celsius warmer throughout its seasonal change. That's horrific.
It absolutely is. I have an update, actually, guys, from Louise Clifford. Sandy, I believe about a week or so, or a couple of weeks ago, I read a little letter from Louise, who lives in Australia, in Queensland, and she's been experiencing tremendous drought, and it was scary because everybody's reservoirs were dry and full of weeds. So Australia is getting some rain now, and Louise says, it's raining, hooray. Actually, it's flooding in some places. We need the rain so badly. The fire on Fraser Island is not out, but it's being contained, and I think the other 2 fires near me have been put out. Such a relief, right?
Yeah.
I've got an observation, and it's just a weird, ironic, cruel thing, and it's as the lungs of the planet burn, right? That would be the Amazon, Indonesia, wherever there's a huge amount of burning going along with oxygen producing forests. We've been set upon by COVID, right? I mean, that's kind of a strange analogy because COVID, of course, affects the lungs. So, just weird.
It is weird. It's an analogy. I mean, I can see it.
Yeah.
A lot of people are looking for those analogies and those answers.
I think just very briefly, I'll try to do it in 20 seconds or 30 seconds, but since the state of the planet, I mean, we should mention that, the ongoing global pandemic. Here in the United States, it's clear that public policy efforts have failed to contain the outbreak. Policy efforts have failed to provide relief to the population. Unfortunately, I think that's an indicator of how we're going to deal with future pandemics. And of course, there will be future pandemics. In the United States, we're over, I believe the number is close to 260,000 dead. We have over close to 8 million infected, and the numbers around the world are exploding. So we did not contain the crisis here.
And it also gives you a glimpse into how well we'll do with climate change. I mean, just like, the denial. You can literally find people that deny COVID deaths, and the number is actually 290 now. 290,000. Yeah.
290,000. I have a.
And people deny that those deaths happened. They deny that they have anything to do with COVID, or it's a weird twilight zone where you live in, where people will actively deny reality, but that's what they do with climate change. They actively deny reality, and that's what just something humans are capable of doing. And they can just turn it off and just say, oh, it's this, oh, it's that, oh, it's just the weather, oh, it was just, just this person being overweight or being this or that, and that's why they died. It didn't have anything to do with this virus. It's just a flu. It's the same deal. It's the same thing. And many of the same people that deny COVID deny climate change.
Denial is one of the most powerful defense mechanisms there is. And I have a little.
I really believe, Nick. I really believe that this high level of denial and kind of like what I think is like a delusion of reality, I think it's really related to the 5 stages of grief. I think people inside, they know it and they can't handle it. They don't want to know it. And so they throw as hard as they can into this crazy ass denial syndrome, but it's really just really a stage of grief,
Yeah, it is. It's just frightening because when you're in that state, in that particular stage, you're the least psychologically capable of doing anything to help deal with the problem. I mean, with COVID, it might be something as simple as just putting a mask on. You won't do that, or having a giant gathering, or with climate change, it manifests politically in not doing anything about the deal with the problem or the predicament or whatever it is. Even if it's a predicament, something you can't change the outcome. Purely, there are lots of things we could be doing to alleviate suffering, but we don't do those things because you have to you're stuck in denial.
Yeah, but besides that, there's a political reason. And the political reason is that the elite, I hate to sound like this, but the elitists or the wealthy people, it's hitting the poorer people, the less fortunate, the people that they up there in the 1%, the oligarchy in our country, don't care about. And I can't help but thinking, how many people were on Social Security and Medicare that passed away from COVID out of those 200,000? Because today, Alex Azar gets on, or today or yesterday, and says, and whether or not you are for a vaccine or not, it's not really about the vaccine, but they are supposed to be giving preference to seniors, especially seniors in, living, communal living situations. And this administration is delaying. They want to delay that for that population. And they're delaying it, but they're lying about it. I mean, it is opposite world. It's awful. And I really think that they don't care about the vulnerable people because it's wiping out a population that, is most likely in their minds a drag on the books. And I'm sorry, but I feel that way. And that the same thing about climate change and environmental pollution affects disproportionately, minority areas, and these elitists don't give a shit.
Yeah, I have 2 things to say. First, a little bit of my background, I'm a first aid CPR instructor, and the one thing I'll say about accepting the reality of crisis. People who accept the reality of crisis, the people who prepare for it, know how to respond when it strikes. They don't freeze and they don't panic. They act. The people who deny the reality of crisis are completely taken by surprise. They are paralyzed and they panic. Either position to make things worse. And I've seen this in real time. Even dealing with When I was in LA last year, I had a first aid emergency where a infant was on the ground, not breathing. There were 5 adults standing around. When I say adults, I mean people over 35. Know what to do. And little do they know, for every 1 minute that you are not breathing, increases the chances of fatality increase by 10%. And because these people didn't know what to do in the state of crisis, they were losing vital time. And it's likely that the child's now suffered permanent injury. And I think about that in terms of the climate crisis. I think about that in terms of the COVID crisis. The people who fare the best are the people who accept the reality of crisis. And they have emergency plans and act on those plans when those crises arise. And what we've showed here in the United States, that the only crisis is a shock doctrine, that we will exploit the people. I mean, think about this. Despite the denial that's kind of being pronunciated in our society, 50% of Americans support a Green New Deal, and over 75% of Americans support action on climate change. And yet, that's almost completely out of the national conversation. So if you think about it, we have an extremely abusive politics. Indian writer Amitash Ghosh calls a great derangement. So it's deeper than just the commercial style denial that we see. There's something intrinsically sick about our Western American society.
I see it every day.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that a light, airy topic? Oh, we do deal with the heavy stuff, and that's why we.
Yeah, I mean, grappling with reality is not supposed to be light or entertaining. It is intense, and it's deep, and it's dark, but it's real, and that's why it has to be grappled with, because it's real.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. You said it very well. So would everyone like to have a last, and thank you, Antonio, that was really good. A last little thank you, and I'll say mine first. Thank you, you guys, for making this happen, and for your expertise and your willingness and your desire to communicate and talk about these issues on Environmental Coffee House. I thank you, and everybody else behind the scenes, thanks you.
I was just going to say thanks everybody for listening, and I think it was a great discussion of important topics that we face. Reality is not always a pleasant place to be, but it's better than denial or delusion.
Yeah.
I'd like to say thank you to both of you guys and to Sandy. Really honored to be able to spend these times with you discussing and looking together at the light of the approach of the oncoming train as we sit here, and I commend your courage to take a good look at this and be able to help process it for humanity.
Yeah. Tony, you want to?
And I just want to say thank you. I just want to say thank you as well to everyone here and to our listeners and our viewers, because you guys are here with us during this, and it is a lot to process emotionally and spiritually, and it gives you a lot to think about and also to be thankful for. So I would just have people think about that even though it seems like we are doing the biblical fall from grace, we are still in the Garden of Eden, and it was beautiful. It is beautiful.
It is beautiful. Well, I love you guys.
Mm-hmm.
All right, guys. Thank you. All right.